I have this illustration that I use. Chiefly, I use it in my intercultural communication class, but I also sometimes use it in my interpersonal communication class in the unit on language. I start them off thinking, imagine that you are, for your foreign language, taking Mandarin Chinese. And on the one hand, it's a very hard language to learn, but think about going into the job market after you graduate being fluent in Mandarin Chinese, and think about how that improves your prospects of getting hired in a lot of different settings. And that has them feeling pretty motivated. You know, this would be cool. If I do the hard work, this will pay off. And then I say, now imagine that the instructor of the class, every time you open your mouth to say a word, she slaps her hands over her ears and says, no, 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 you have a terrible American accent. And every time you talk and you sound so American, I fear for my life. I think you're going to whip out your gun and point it at me and shoot me, just like all Americans do. And if she did that every single time you tried to speak Chinese, how motivated would you be to try to learn Chinese? Would you even keep showing up to that class? And usually they're pretty wide-eyed by then, and they agree, no, that would not be a very effective or nurturing learning environment. And I go from there to a folk history, because I'm not much of a historian, of the controversy in the 1990s over Ebonics. Now, Ebonics was the product of linguists, and its more formal name is African American Vernacular English. And in the 1990s, the public school district in Oakland, California, their language arts curriculum incorporated a study of Ebonics. And unfortunately, talk radio hosts who were in the business of selling a product, they latched onto that and they went to town on it and riffed on it for a number of weeks. The thing about talk radio hosts is they are selling a product just as surely as the food carts downtown in my city. And the food carts are always looking for what's the new ingredient, what's the new wrinkle, what's the new special that's going to make people choose their food cart over somebody else's. And talk radio hosts, they are looking for what is going on that I can narrate in such a way that it will whip my listeners up into a state of righteous indignation and rage, and in particular in a way that they'll look around and see a lot of other people agreeing with them, and they can be united in their rage, and they can stand together, and they can denounce whatever the outrage is in the hopes that they can wipe it out. And even if they can't wipe it out, it feels very satisfying to feel that angry. Because so many people walk around with such a hunger, such a puzzling, almost inexplicable hunger for a setting in which it is acceptable to be angry together. And probably that's a lot of the explanation for going and watching sporting events, but at any rate, what they did is they took the Oakland School District adopting Ebonics and incorporating it into the language arts curriculum, and they said this is the illustration of the worst possible excess of the bleeding heart liberal. Look at what the bleeding heart liberal does. The bleeding heart liberal says, don't bother learning how to speak correctly. The way you speak in the street, pronouncing all these words wrong, spelling everything wrong, we don't want your little feelings to get hurt, so we're going to tell you that it's its own language. And then we're going to say that anybody who says you should speak correctly is just a racist. Typical bleeding heart liberals. Well, yeah, if you want to violently oversimplify, you can go that route in explaining what's going on. Or you could recognize that when people are grouped together into speaking communities, when people speak chiefly to one another and their community is defined by a boundary that's not fully permeable. And what I mean by that is they do talk to some people outside the community, but they speak much, much more to people inside the community and only rarely to people outside the community. So it's not an all or nothing thing, but it is a disproportionate thing that they mostly speak to people who have the same speaking practices as they do. Anytime that happens, they are going to use phonemes differently. You can see this particular phenomenon happen any part of the country where there is an accent, whether it's New England, whether it's the Deep South, anything like that. If you go to a big city in that region, you won't hear the accent, as strongly or as often, because a lot of people come and go from different parts of the country and they all talk to each other and they tend to dilute the strength of the accent. But if you go to the small towns in the remote corners of those regions, you go to a small southern town, you go to a remote New England town, you're going to hear that accent full strength because they all reinforce it with one another, and not that many people come in from the outside to blur it or blend it with their own accent. And the same is true, by the way, in African American communities, between African American speakers, who for much of the period, going all the way back to when they were brought over here in the slave trade, have lived in deliberately segregated communities, were driven into neighborhoods where that was the only neighborhood in which they were allowed to live. So, that particular set of phonemes, the basic elements of spoken language, they have things that they do consistently. And many of them, linguists will tell you, have their roots in languages that were spoken in Africa and continue to be spoken in Africa. One very simple example is, instead of saying ask, a whole lot of African American vernacular English speakers will say axe. And that is traceable to some variations in languages that they spoke before they crossed the Atlantic and came to the United States. So, let's say you're an English teacher in Oakland, and let's say you've got a whole lot of African American students, and a whole lot of your students speak African American vernacular English. And one of the things you want to do is you want to help them speak in a way that if they get accepted to law school, that if they go to college and get all the way through, get an MBA and want to work in a Fortune 500 company and want to move up into management, that they have the skill of speaking in a way that will engender confidence. Now, on the one hand, you could correct them every time they open their mouth, and you could say, no, you sound like a thug, you sound like a hoodlum, I'm afraid you're going to mug me or rape me when you talk that way. And you'd make a lot of talk radio hosts happy. Or you could say, your parents and your grandparents, they talk one way, and they comfort you, and they've taught you life lessons, all talking a certain way. That way is valid. You understand them when they talk. Not a thing wrong with it. You are also fully competent in speaking that way. They understand you when you talk. But there's another way. We're going to teach you to be bilingual. We're going to teach you another way of speaking. We're going to teach you standard spoken English, and that will be your second language. And when you go into the workplace, if you speak in that way in your job interviews, if you speak in that way when you go to the office each day, that's going to help you move up. And when you characterize it that way, that's a much better, much more nurturing learning environment. In much the same way, if that Chinese instructor were to say, you speak English your way, but if you want to be understood by Chinese speakers, the way you speak Chinese has to be adjusted this way. Instead of attacking the way you speak, validate the way you speak, but then show you a different way. So, I started off thinking about that. I was also thinking about what Barack Obama had to do back in the 2008 campaign when some excerpts from sermons preached by his pastor, Jeremiah Wright, when those hit the nightly news. There was a lot of pressure on Obama because these sermon excerpts were shocking, and to a lot of people, not to me. I'd heard this kind of preaching before because of my line of work. But the Reverend Wright had, in a lot of instances, attacked the United States, called the United States unjust, racist, which it is, and there was a lot of pressure on Barack Obama to distance himself, to just denounce Reverend Wright and say, he doesn't in any sense speak for me. And he gave a speech, which still some people say is the finest speech he ever gave, although I think there are a couple of other candidates for that. It was called A More Perfect Union, and it was what he had to say about race. And he said, some of these things that the Reverend Wright has said, I don't agree with him. He does not speak for me when he says them. But I will not let that drive me. I will not let all your pressure drive me to denounce him any more than I can denounce my white grandmother. Let me tell you what she said in the past about African Americans. But I can't give up on her. She's family, and I love her. And so, where I am this week is I see all around me that it just seems like there's this pervasive sense of insecurity and dislocation, and a response to it is a pathological loyalty to the people that we recognize as belonging to our tribe, and we put pressure on one another to group everyone into stark, distinct categories of heroes or villains, and that we cling to heroes and follow them blindly, and that we strip humanity from villains, and the only thing they're fit for is infinite punishment. And I don't think anybody, when they're thinking right, would say that a community can endure if you think of the people around you that way. I got started this way when I saw an online conversation between a whole lot of people who, honestly, their political position is very, very close to mine. And they were dismissing Trump supporters, calling them crackers, saying we should have just let them secede. This was actually in response to, in Charleston, there was a big rally of some pretty blatantly, openly white nationalist people, white supremacists. They were protesting against removing some statues that honored Confederate generals. I think that was the nature of the event. I know that they had a rally. I don't know if anyone was removing the generals. I think that happened in New Orleans. At any rate, the fact that what people who politically are kind of near my alignment were saying was, no more trying to bridge the gap. No more trying to find out what will make sense to them. Just reject them. Just distance yourself. Just say, you're wrong, you're stupid, we give up. And the problem is, that is the exact same violence that my political opponents, it seems to me in my perception, have been using on me, going all the way back to that big, big surge of talk radio in the 1990s. It seems as though people at the other end of this not always helpful political spectrum, it seems what they've said is, we reject you, you're stupid, we give up, we will not reach out to you, we will not try to put our issues in terms that you understand or that appeal to you, you are simply our enemies. And I worry when the people who are at my end of this political spectrum start saying, okay, it's time for us to do the same thing. And they say it because, well, look how far they've gone, now it's our turn. But all that is classic escalation. And one of the episodes I have coming up is to talk more about what comes out of the scholarship into conflict. And I teach a class in conflict, and I've dropped a few things from it, but I had kind of an important insight sometime this week, but I think that's next week's episode. At any rate, all you do when you do that is you just escalate it further. You just dump more gasoline on the fire. You do nothing constructive. You don't bring the situation, you don't steer it in the direction that anyone's life, including your own, might get better. The other problem with it is, when people that I ought to be agreeing with, that I have a strong basis to agree with, when those people rationalize it and say, I am so angry I don't care anymore. I am so angry I reject these people. Well, if you're that angry, you're also so angry you don't see clearly what you're doing. When people say, I am done with these others, I am furious, nobody seems to grasp that you don't make wise decisions when you make them in that state of fury. When you are in that state of fury, you need to deal with that immediate problem. But what you don't need to do is harness that fury and say, the decision I want to make when I'm this angry is the one I'll commit to. Instead, any decision that you feel tempted to make when you're that angry should be presumed guilty until proven innocent overwhelmingly. And in this situation, I don't think that it can be proven innocent or that it can be proven to be a wise decision. And sometimes I've thought back to the 1990s, to the big upsurge in talk radio. Rush Limbaugh is the easy shorthand, and he was, I think, the most profitable and most successful of all of them, but he wasn't the only one. He was the leader of a whole industry that it looked to me from my position like it just sort of surged up out of nowhere. But then if you go back further and you see all the vitriol of the 1960s over race, over the Vietnam War, over poverty, if you see all of the landmark decisions that came out of the Supreme Court where there was not the hard, slow work of deliberation, there was not community building. Instead, what there was a sort of violent, wrenching end to the deliberation. Thurgood Marshall liked to say, I am the world's original gradualist. I just think 150 years is long enough. But the problem is, those court decisions were all amputations. Those court decisions were all radical surgery. And they remind me sometimes of things like bariatric surgery to bring people's weight under control. Well, yes, it does. It does make a radical change. But there are so many people I know who have had various kinds of surgery hoping to get a weight problem under control, and then they've held on to the exact same practices, and they've undone the good that the surgery did in the first place and really made themselves much, much sicker, just disfigured themselves by continuing with the same habits of activity and eating that they had before the surgery. And I think that's kind of what we've done politically. That's kind of what all those court decisions did. And I think that, in many ways, is what set the stage for all of the vitriol of the 90s, all of the talk radio, and so forth. And that's a tangled set of thoughts. I'm not sure that that produced anything that was entirely helpful, but the next thought that gets me to is, you don't love people because they're perfect. If you love someone because of all their good qualities, if that's the explanation you give when asked why you love someone, then you don't understand what the word love means. You can enjoy someone because of their good qualities, but you don't love them because of their good qualities. You don't even love them despite their flaws. That's a misunderstanding of love. If you love people at all, you love them flaws and all. And that's what Barack Obama was saying about his grandmother and also about his pastor. And that's what these African American students in Oakland were saying about their parents at home who maybe didn't speak standard spoken English, but spoke African American vernacular English, but were still deserving of respect. And so to all these people who mostly agree with me politically, who say, these other people, they're crackers. They should have been allowed to secede. Give up on them. Well, no. In some cases, they're my family members. Very definitely, I have a whole lot of friends that I've made over the years, although some I haven't talked to in a long time, who fit squarely within that population. Before I moved to where I live now in the Pacific Northwest, I lived in a classic tiny rural town where I was probably one of the few in the entire town who was not a Republican in political commitments. And a whole lot of the people that I knew there, very, very lovable, warm people, friends that I wish I talked to more often so that I could keep that friendship more alive. But they accepted me even though I was different, and I accepted them even though I didn't agree with them. And anyone who says to me, write them off because they're Trump supporters and that makes them crackers, well, no, it doesn't. Even though some of the things that come out of their mouth trouble me, I am not willing to say, I'm done with you. Because we don't love people despite their flaws. We love them flaws and all, and they love us flaws and all. Now, the question is, how far do you extend that practice? How far do you extend that principle? I think what makes people eligible for that sort of unconditional love tends to be familiarity, tends to be intimacy. We offer that kind of love to people that we know. And the problem with that, the mistake we make there, because these people that I've just mentioned that I knew from this tiny rural town, I knew them. I had done life with them. I'd been up close with them. Chiefly, I went to church with them. But then I see a lot of people on the news who say equally ugly things, and I'm repelled by them. But they're strangers to me. I don't have any history with them. I don't know any of the other things about them. But the thing is, we're all strangers. We are all strangers. My immediate family are strangers to me, and I am a stranger to them. Married couples are strangers to one another. They work around it. They make up polite fictions. But there are too many experiences you'll have in your married life where you will discover you thought you knew your spouse, but you never really did. One of the things I think that we've got to find our way to is the ability to treat others in our community, them being mutual members of that community, that's at least enough intimacy, that's at least enough familiarity that we can take the risk of being loving and being vulnerable. The town I live in right now, because politically the critical mass, the leadership does tend to be fairly left-wing, there are a lot of police policies that are a little permissive when it comes to people living on the street, and there are a lot of services in town because a lot of people have made a project in their life showing compassion to people who are unhoused. And as a result, there's another segment of the population who really, really hates all the homeless people in town. And that is such a failure of compassion. And that is such a case of malign, condemning attribution. But they're part of our community too. And what I wish I could see and what I wish we could find our way to is they're part of your community at the very least. You love them, flaws included. You don't love the flaws, and maybe you work with them on the flaws, and maybe you distance yourself to not enable the flaws. Maybe I don't enable people if they want to talk about the things that they think Trump is doing that are wonderful. I don't enable that. Maybe I challenge them. But can I at least accept that they are to me like Barack Obama's grandmother was to him? Some of the things that she said were very hurtful, but she was still his grandmother. Now, there's another kind of trope, another kind of argument that's grown up around this exact situation, and it is a sarcastic and dismissive one. Both sides are bad, so vote Republican. A lot of the people who would be quick to dismiss Trump supporters as crackers and that they should have seceded, they would say what I'm doing is a false equivalence. That when they do it to their opponents, it's not the same as when their opponents do it to them, and I am not at all persuaded by that. Now, I'm not saying both sides are identical. I'm not saying the move is identical on both sides. And I am definitely not saying that the political positions taken by both sides are equal in merit. I don't think so. I think one side has it more nearly right than the other. I think the other is in the grips of a severe pathology having to do with economic dislocation at the moment. But I am saying, and this comes straight out of conflict scholarship, relationships survive when both parties to the relationship own up to how they are feeding the problem. When there is a troubled relationship and one of the parties to the relationship says, the other one is doing all of it, the other one is flawed and I am innocent, that relationship is doomed. But in relationships where both sides say, I am infuriated by what the other party is doing. I find what the other party is doing intolerable, but I see how I am not helping. I see how I have these behaviors, and these behaviors make it worse. And if I mastered these behaviors and put these behaviors in check, and the other party to this relationship would make these changes, we would at least have a chance. I almost called it a fighting chance, but that'd be an unfortunate choice of words. And I think about, could we make it that far? Because that step doesn't seem impossible. Could people on all parts of this political spectrum, could they say, because I want the community to work, because I want the country to succeed, when I come and engage, when I talk about the people I disagree with politically, one of the things I will commit myself to do is I will admit to how I am fueling this problem. I will bring that to the table every time. Now, once I've brought that to the table, I'm going to talk about what I don't like about the other side, and we're going to have a lively conversation about it. But I will be open to talking about what I am doing that is contributing to the problem. The survival of the relationship has to be the non-negotiable part, I think. It's got to be the bedrock. If the survival of the relationship between members of a community is negotiable, if that's on the table, then you wind up like the former Yugoslavia. You wind up like Northern Ireland. What you do is you try to cleanse communities. And that word, cleanse, that should sound ominous. I'm talking about ethnic cleansing, although in this case it would be political cleansing. If you see political opponents as people to be purged, as people to be vanquished and dismissed, and you no longer accept there's got to be a relationship, you've got to be able to coexist. If you see the others as effectively a criminal class, if you infrahumanize them, treat them as lower than human, then you're unleashing the kind of base-level violence that'll take you down with it. You're effectively living in an apartment building with someone else and setting the building on fire, hoping only their apartment will burn. When I was in middle school and I took one of my first classes in communication, there was a short unit, I think it was part of an early attempt at media literacy, talking about tactics of propaganda. And you may have run into this unit at some point over the years, and it talked about glittering generalities, and it talked about bandwagon appeals and so forth. But the one appeal that I am increasingly troubled by, and it's one that it is becoming more and more clear to me, is the fertile seedbed for a lot of this political dysfunction, is the fallacy of the straw figure. The fallacy of the straw figure. The thing about it is, in my academic field, I deal a lot with fallacies, and not everything. People want to apply, when people learn about fallacies, they want to go around and slap the label of fallacy on everything in sight, and it doesn't really work that way, because one of the fallacies is appeal to authority. And you don't end a discussion just by appealing to an authority, because authorities disagree sometimes, so that is a fallacy. But people will sometimes then want to say, well, any appeal to authority at all, since appeal authority is a fallacy, there's no such thing as authority. And it's not as mechanical as that. And then there are appeals to fear. And people will say, well, you're not allowed in argument to say that anything is dangerous, because that's an appeal to fear, and appeal to fear is a fallacy. Well, no. In certain contexts, trying to make certain kinds of arguments as though they are absolute and discussion enders, that's a fallacy. But in other instances, like the ad hominem fallacy, this argument isn't valid because you're the one who made it. Well, that's not always a fallacy either. If a family is deliberating over what they want to do and an outsider speaks up and says, this is what you should do, you're perfectly justified in saying, look, you're not part of these deliberations. This is between the members of this family. That would be the ad hominem fallacy, but in that case, it's perfectly legitimate. Now, I've gone off to talking about fallacies just to say I'm not that big of a fan of labeling and eliminating fallacies for the purpose of trying to make your arguments better, with one exception, the straw figure fallacy. And the straw figure fallacy happens when you take someone else's account of their position and you weaken it, you caricature it, you talk about it in a way that makes it sound irrational, but is not a faithful representation of what the person said in the first place. So when all those talk radio hosts say that the bleeding heart liberals, they just don't want to hurt the feelings of these poor students, and they don't want to teach them how to talk right, well, they're committing the straw figure fallacy. That was not the explanation behind adopting African American vernacular English as part of the language arts curriculum in Oakland in the first place. And straw figuring like that, it is deliberately infrahumanizing your opponent. It is taking what the other person said and in a dishonest way doing damage to it to characterize that other person as less rational, less intelligent than they are. And if I were to say there's a place to begin, maybe what we should be teaching our children is we should be sensitizing them to straw figuring. That anytime anyone straw figures, even the people who agree with you, when they straw figure the people you disagree with, that's when you should step up and say, I will not tolerate that. These people I disagree with, they have an argument. They have reasons. And if I'm confident that I'm right, my ethics will require that I take their explanation as they would have made it. That I will not mock, I will not use inappropriate humor to straw figure them, because that infrahumanizes them. That paints them as less rational than they are. That is a breach of civility. That is a departure from respect. I am better than that. I don't need to use those tactics. I can meet them on the best version of the appeal they want to make. I remember when I first discovered that Chaim Perlman had a whole section in his book on argumentation, The New Rhetoric, talking about ridicule. I remember how appalled I was. And I think I have a little more understanding of what he was doing in talking about ridicule, but I still am deep down troubled, and deep down my face is set against the idea that ridicule is a valid tactic of argument. It is one that people use. It's a common tactic, but a lot of things that are commonly practiced are not ethical. So, I don't think you can be asked to give up on your ancestors. I don't think you can be asked to dismiss your family, to separate yourself from your friends, and I don't think anybody should be straw figuring anybody.